In my last video about Mario Kart, we took a look at a handful of Nitro tracks to see what made for good or bad design. But that begs the question, given a second chance, how well can a course designed for older physics work in a modern engine? And on a broader scale, how has the concept of a retro track changed over the years? It's time for a second lap of my Mario Kart track analysis. Without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Kardino. Approaching this concept, I plan to review every retro course using my rating system from before, but I ultimately decided against it because I would have to change how the creativity axis was defined, and at that point, the score wouldn't be very intuitive. On top of that, what's the point of using my system if you couldn't directly compare two scores? Most importantly, I didn't think there were many conclusions to be drawn from going the same route as before. So this analysis is going to be structured a little differently. I'd like to walk through the evolution of retro tracks to see how their implementation was approached throughout the years. That means, of course, we start with Super Circuit, which included all 20 courses from SMK. There's a lot that can be said about these things. First, the fact that they're all here at all is pretty impressive. Remember, when this game was released, the first entry wasn't even 10 years old yet. In fact, the GBA is known for its Super Nintendo ports because one could argue they were no more retro than the Wii U was in 2021. Not to mention, the idea of retro gaming wasn't nearly as widespread, hence why they were probably simply labeled as extra tracks. This means, however, that they leave mixed impressions. Starting with the positives, they play pretty smoothly. In fact, if we take Donut Plains 3 as an example, I didn't find it nearly as annoying as the original. And if you were a kid at the time, it's unlikely you'd think twice that these courses were recycled. It would just be cool that your game content doubled. However, you might notice how much easier they are. The biggest flaw about a lot of these tracks is that key elements were removed. From the pipes in Mario Circuit 1, to the Monty Moles in Donut Plains 2, to the thwomps in Bowser Castle 3, a ton of obstacles are nowhere to be seen. Even the dash pads in Ghost Valley 2 and 3 are missing. And while those last two omissions don't outright ruin the race, the Bowser Castle tracks arguably suffer the most. Considering they are often enclosed by walls, the only real elements left in their names are sharp turns and maybe some gaps to jump over. But even if you're hit before a ramp, you still will make it over, so I don't even think I can label them as more than spectacle. Rainbow Road has also been ravaged, although its thin paths and sharp corners do still keep it interesting. Still, it's confusing because many of these elements were in the normal tracks, so I don't understand what went wrong. The final problem is admittedly trivial, but the backgrounds don't always match the course. Even considering the existing in-game scenes, there are some choices that just don't make sense. For example, Donut Plains uses the Riverside Park theme, which is a completely different biome. Maybe Peach Circuit or Lakeside Park would have been better choices? Mario Circuit already uses the former, along with its own. Even worse though is that Choco Valley is now in Sunset Wilds, which makes the muddy track look downright ugly. The only tracks that I think were translated almost flawlessly as a whole were Koopa Beach and Vanilla Lake. At the end of the day, you could definitely make the argument that these retro tracks weren't very good. In fact, almost everything besides the basic track shapes were changed for the worse. However, given their proper context, I don't feel nearly as disappointed as one might expect. Because again, these were simply presented as extra content. Do I wish they were better? Obviously, but I'm more so glad that they exist at all. It's only when we get to Mario Kart DS where my expectations are raised. It's fair to say that this is where most people were introduced to the idea of retro tracks, myself included. In fact, when talking about this game, its 8-Cup Grand Prix is one of its key legacies. However, when you actually look at the content on offer, it's fair to say things are a little underwhelming in retrospect. Firstly, they chose some of the most boring double dash tracks possible. The best port here is probably Yoshi's Circuit, But even then, several elements are removed, and it's a somewhat underwhelming way to finish the Lightning Cup. Baby Park is certainly an infamous example, but it feels almost unnecessary to even mention the other two. Mushroom Bridge is just a worse Shroom Ridge now, including the name, and Luigi's Circuit is upscaled too large, with even the alternate path removed. As for SNES and GBA courses, it seems the bare minimum was done to update them. They are now 3D, so that's something, but they weren't adjusted in any other way, leading to an easier experience with the more modern controls. And even beyond that, again, the track selection is extremely boring. The only two I'd still consider interesting in DS are Sky Garden and Koopa Beach 2. Maybe someone could convince me that Choco Island 2 is good as well, but it would be an uphill battle. The worst part is that it's not like the DS couldn't handle varying altitude, because we see it in the Nitro tracks all the time. So why these tracks turned out the way they did is somewhat confusing, because it would seem that they could have modernized them if they wanted to. Luckily, N64 courses saw the most improvement. Since they were already in 3D, they had more interesting aesthetics, while still having room for improvement in the graphics department. In fact, I have no complaints with how Frappe Snowland and Moo Moo Farms were handled. Even Choco Mountain was translated with no issue, outside of the Punishing Ridge. But even then, I'm more okay with it because at this point, you basically have to try to fall off. The only course I'd say was reduced in quality is Banshee Boardwalk. I just think it's too easy in the new scenario, and the spooky atmosphere was largely untouched. Still, on the whole, these four are a bright spot in the otherwise murky field of retro tracks. It makes me wonder what the intention was. Did they underestimate how much time it would take to make these things? Or were there really technical restraints? Or maybe they wanted to prioritize faithfulness over modernism? If that were the case, it would make some sense why they chose more plain Double Dash tracks to complement the former 2D courses. After all, next to each other, there would be a very noticeable difference in quality. Obviously, it's easy to name issues with the execution here. Nevertheless, I will say that if choosing between playing the extra tracks in Super Circuit and the retro tracks in DS, I choose the former almost every time. Because the 2D engines are so similar, there was less that needed to be done to make the SMK ports feel enjoyable. Even in their most basic state, they're often fun to play on. I can't say the same about a lot of the selection here. To end things on a high note though, to double the track count in a 3D game was still an ambitious concept at the time, so let's see how Wii followed up. In short, its retro selection is better in some ways, but not because of how they were remade. I think they just had a better list. The SNES tracks are once again simply 3D versions with maybe some upscaling. The two Super Circuit tracks are fine, but Bowser Castle 3 in particular feels too easy. So on that front, there's not been much improvement. On the flip side though, N64 once again saw the best results. All of its choices are solid, the visuals are improved, and although easier with the newer controls, they still hold their weight. DS is a mixed bag, with the main problem being that two of these picks are just kinda weak. I don't know who picked Yoshi Falls, but I have some questions. Finally, the Double Dash ports are almost unnoteworthy. Sure, they're better picks than before, and there's nothing seriously wrong with them. At worst, you could say that the trick ramps can sometimes feel unnecessary. For example, I don't know how many casual players who elect to use the half pipes in Waluigi Stadium. But on the flip side, you could make the argument that they feel a little underwhelming. For example, DK Mountain is nice enough, but DK Summit is already in the game. And while Mario Circuit is okay as a track, it's an odd way to finish the Leaf Cup. Now, something to note is that with the retro selection as a whole, they often are enhanced with the trick system, and it really can make things feel fresh, despite many of the game's repeated problems. There are even occasional additions like in Ghost Valley 2. But once again, I think the intention was to keep things as faithful as possible, rather than reworking them unnecessarily. So in conclusion, I do find Wii to be an improvement, but mostly because of the track selection and trick system, rather than an increased effort to reimagine these classics. which again isn't necessarily a bad decision, but very questionable when the Nitro Cups are so strong in comparison. Things definitely feel lopsided. The good news is that Mario Kart 7 saw a turn for the better. Not just because they made more changes, but because these courses feel like hand-picked fan favorites. Admittedly, the SNES and GBA tracks are still that basic translation that we're used to, but even still, they're better than before. Mario Circuit 2, aside from being the best version of the 4, now has a glide ramp where the jump used to be. Bowser Castle 1 feels improved with the modified ramp physics, and there's even a useless gliding ramp starting on lap 2. That's just the beginning though. Koopa Beach from the N64 makes a return, but now the shortcut implements the rising and falling tide in a way that actually can be tricky to utilize. Not to mention, the gliding and underwater driving breathes some new life into a level that was somewhat forgettable in the original. Of course, it doesn't stick out too much afterward, but it's fun enough in the moment. Now, a quick thing I should mention is that in 2 tracks in particular, I think they changed too much, those being Koopa Cape and Daisy Cruiser. Now, I've already spoken about these things multiple times, but the brief version is that Daisy Cruiser had some of its challenge removed with the pool, and some of the atmosphere with the engine room. Meanwhile, Koopa Cape saw its best feature ruined with an underwater section. It's an interesting case where, intuitively, it's the obvious adjustment, but in reality, it hurt the design. But again, I'm treading on old ground. Well, more so than usual considering the subject. For the most part, the game is pretty good at defying expectations or making logical changes. Mushroom Gorge's cave can now be glided through, Calamari Desert now features a glide ramp in case the train is about to block you, and as sad as I'm sure we all were to see the iconic net bridge removed in Maple Treeway, it was probably the right decision. Now, predictably, not every track is a winner. Luigi's tracks are a personal weak aspect for me, but you can definitely see that they were getting braver in their porting efforts. They're still the same tracks at the end of the day, but they don't feel as blatantly dated as they might have. So on the whole, while we had a better Nitro selection, 7 easily clears it in the retro department. Is it because implementing the new mechanics here required more drastic changes than a few ramps? Quite possibly, but it's still an improvement, and that upward trend wasn't about to stop there. To my perspective, 8 redefined retro tracks just as much as DS did. In fact, part of the reason I chose to talk about retro tracks is because of how much it changed our expectations. With the game being over 10 years old at this point, it's easy to forget what things were like prior. Let's check in on our old friend, Donut Plains 3. Not only was it the most reworked SNES course to this point, but it was the worst track in the series to boot. Now, my only criticism is that it was too toned down. But that's an issue that vanishes on 200cc. Sherbertland from Double Dash was completely recontextualized with its underwater sections. Yoshi Valley? Still isn't great, but at least you don't fall for an eternity. Wario Stadium is almost unrecognizable now, and N64's Rainbow Road saw the biggest improvement possible. There are, once again, a few questionable ones. Toad's Turnpike has almost no tension now with its traffic, and to be honest, I found the Sunset to suit it better. Dry Desert removed the tornado and added an oasis, which I personally don't find too enjoyable to drive through. But there are plenty of other tracks that didn't fix what wasn't broken, like Royal Raceway and Music Park. I'd like to specifically point out one example though that I find funny to think about. GBA Mario Circuit was never one to stand out in its original form, and here it feels like they were stumped on how to improve it. So seemingly for the sake of adding verticality, they suspended a single turn of the track. Plus, of course, they added a glide ramp later on. But still, it's pretty hilarious how spontaneous it feels. It's like they chose the track before deciding what to do with it. But that wasn't the last Super Circuit would see, because 2 more courses would be included in the original Mario Kart 8 DLC. And I feel that this is an important point in the timeline because it was the first time a 2D map was fully transformed into a 3D environment. Cheeseland and Ribbon Road are almost entirely new courses. And in a group with variable port quality, these are undoubtedly the cream of the crop. While the layouts are faithful, the new elements make them indistinguishable from new ideas. and thus I see the evolution of retro tracks to be complete. You may wonder why we're skipping the BCP, but I've already given it a full review, and in short, while it was one of the better moments of the series, you don't need me to tell you that it wasn't their best work in the retro aspect. And the same goes for Mario Kart Tour, although it may be unfair to give it the same expectations as the others. Nevertheless, we can now step back and appreciate just how much the very idea of retro tracks have changed, from an impressive but flawed bonus, to standardized content, to eventually fully reworked ideas. We have now reached a point where the difference between Nitro and retro tracks is only in their origin, something proven by how Mario Kart World mixes them together. And as much as I'm still hoping for Wario Coliseum to make a return one day, I'd say I'm most excited for some more 2D remakes. There's a goldmine of potential, and I'd seriously recommend playing the originals if you're able. They'll give you more of an appreciation for their design than games prior to 8 likely could, which, in my opinion, is what retro tracks should really aim to do. Reuse great ideas so these classic designs can be appreciated by new and old fans alike. Anyway, until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.